Today's episode of the TribCast is sponsored by the Safer Texas Alliance, Protecting American Consumers Together, the Texas Managed Care Alliance, and the Lone Star Economic Alliance. Welcome to the Texas Tribune's TribCast. I'm Eleanor Klibanoff, women's health reporter, joined as always by my co-host, editor-in-chief Matthew Watkins, who is once again in a little screen. Matthew, where are you?
I am in New Orleans for a work conference. I'm in the Hotel Monteleone, which I learned yesterday on the quick little thing that plays on loop when you turn on your TV, was a favorite haunt of such luminary lights as Ernest Hemingway, William Faulkner, Richard Ford. And, I think they're going to add my name to the plaque as soon as I leave. So looking forward to that.
I feel like every hotel in New Orleans, but also sort of everywhere, has like those names as someone who stayed there. I'm like, these people were just in hotels willy-nilly.
They have like suites named after the individual authors. So
they're like really working it.
They're really working it. I'm not in a suite. I'm in a regular little room.
In the Watkins suite.
That's right. Yeah. I'm gonna write it in pen on the door when I leave.
And you were telling us just before we got started that it is allegedly extremely nice weather there.
Yeah, this is the first time I've ever been in New Orleans where it's great weather, 78 degrees, sunny. I hear there's a tornado warning right now in Austin, so I hope everyone's safe.
Yeah, so hate that for us. Love it for you. I will say this episode is a little bit, I fear it's a little bit cursed in that I started working last night at 5 p.m., started working on the script. And as I started working on the script, my power went out. And I thought, that's okay. That's why we have the morning to work on the script. And this morning, I sat down at my desk at 9 a.m. to work on the script, and my power went out. So we're kind of winging it here, I'm going to be honest. And that's on the weirdest, wettest May we're having. But that's not what we're here to talk about. As I just alluded to, this is our first episode in May on an odd-numbered year, which means we are officially in the final month of the regular Texas legislative session. So much has already happened. There's so much left to happen. And to discuss all of this, we are joined by two of the Texas Tribune's best, our ace political reporters, Kayla Guo, who is a politics reporter for the Tribune. Kayla, how are you?
I'm doing all right. Surprisingly not as drenched. I just got back from the Capitol, and it's misting out there. But...
Okay, great. And Renzo Downey.
I was just gonna say, I feel like every legislative session, there's at least one terrible storm that happens, like while people are legislating, and we all like hear the windows rattle and everything like that. So maybe that'll be today.
And it's better than
maybe it already is today. I'm in New Orleans. I have no idea.
He has no idea. He's like, it couldn't be today. It's beautiful and sunny. It is possibly today. It's really quite ominous, but I think it's passing. And Renzo Downey, the lead author of The Blast, our subscription newsletter for Capitol Insiders. Renzo, how are you?
Doing all right. I stayed pretty dry because I somehow found the only 10, 20-minute window when it wasn't raining to bike over here. So
that makes me... You biked over here?
Yeah, that's my one personality trait, so I got to keep it up.
Yeah, that's fair. I get that. Mm-hmm. Real conversation starter. Yeah. Well... I'll be honest, we are in a bit of an unusual position for May 6th. Today May 6th? May 6th. We are, a little less than a month until Sine Die. And on Saturday, the Saturday before this, a couple days ago, Governor Greg Abbott has already signed the biggest bill of the session. On Saturday, he put his Greg Hancock on legislation, creating a $1 billion school voucher program. Despite the power outages, I did manage to write that into the script. This has been, this was like the huge
power tour mic.
Yeah. I really was like, this is the one thing we must get in there. This has been the issue of the session. We've been talking about this all session. They did it. They passed a vouchers program. It passed both chambers. It was signed into law. And we still have a month left. So what is left to do? Matthew, can you remember a session like this where kind of the big swings were done and dusted this early?
I cannot. I think the more memorable sessions tend to be the ones where the big bill doesn't make it across the finish line, like vouchers last year, like the bathroom bill in 2017. Usually when it's an exciting session, it's an exciting session because we're wondering whether they'll get things across the finish line. I think there's still plenty of an opportunity for there to be drama and, special session conversations. But no, this is a impressively efficient way of getting through a major controversial bill. And I think a lot of that credit, goes to Abbott for really pulling this off politically.
Yeah, absolutely. There is another piece of this though with the school vouchers that was sort of its buddy legislation, which was the school finance legislation. Renzo, tell us a little bit about that and where that stands, because that has not already gotten the Greg Hancock.
Correct. Yeah. So, as the House is calling it, this is kind of their Texas two-step plan,
Cute.
where they have the ESA bill, which that's the one that just got signed. That's the voucher bill, and then they also have the public school finance portion, which so far has been only referred to the Senate Education K-16 committee. They got a little fancy with the name this year, and it sounds like Senator Brandon Creighton, he's the chairman of that committee. It sounds like his staff has been reviewing that bill, but there hasn't been much talk about what's actually happening with that bill. Yesterday, so Monday, we had the governor, Dan Patrick. We had Dustin Burrows all kind of put out on social media that they just met. They talked about their priorities. I mean, they've been doing this frequently, but they did it again on Monday. And in that, Burrows mentioned public school funding as one of his priorities. So sounds like maybe that's moving forward. And, I heard from Brad Buckley, who's the chairman of the House Public Education Committee, that, doesn't sound like there's any holdup really, that there's agreement that will get moving soon. So, maybe that's still to come.
Because those are really like, we're seen as like, you could have one without the other. The politics around it was you can't have one without the other. And so now we have ESAs, education savings accounts, as you said. It would be necessary sort of to uphold the promises that they sort of were talking about.
Yes, and I'd say that public schools would certainly not see it as a political move. It's their funding that they're feeling the hurt that they haven't gotten that pay raise since 2019 was that last public education session. So they think they're due.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, this feels to me like kind of standard late May. We got to figure this out, and we're going to figure this out, right? It feels just very hard for me to imagine them getting through this session without figuring out school finance, both because of, as you mentioned, how much the schools need it, but also because if Democrats are going to be attacking Republicans over schools in the upcoming election, it's going to be really nice to have be able to say we put X billion amount of dollars into public schools last year to kind of blunt that attack. So I feel, this is around the time where everyone starts worrying about whether they're going to be able to get something done. But this, feels like one they have to and probably will.
Right. That seemed the fate of the school finance bill seems more set and certain than perhaps some of the other priority legislation that we threatens to potentially ruin our summers as political reporters. Kayla, you've been covering these other two top priorities, which are, the THC ban or regulate question, and then bail reform. Let's start with bail reform. Give us a little background on that as an issue, and where's that stand?
Yep. So this has been a priority of the governor's for a few sessions running now. It hasn't gone through because the constitutional amendments need, this time around, at least 12 Democrats to get on board. Governor Abbott sort of threw a wrench into discussions last week when he called for the legislation to go even further than it does. Basically, the premise is trying to allow judges to deny bail altogether in more cases. The Texas Constitution currently outlines when that can happen, and the goal of this legislation is to widen that list. He called for making it automatic denial of bail in some cases, which again goes further than what the legislation currently does. I think Democrats were a little bit uneasy about that and the overall package, which also calls for automatically denying bail to any undocumented immigrant who commits a crime or is accused of a crime, rather. And so the conversations were about how do we get 12 Democrats on board to get to the 100 votes we need to pass a constitutional amendment. Um, Democrats were calling for some changes to the bill to make it a little more palatable. They wanted to see some measures that would help people on the lower end of crimes, first-time misdemeanor offenders, nonviolent offenders, be able to get out pre-trial and not be detained just because they couldn't afford their bail. So we were trying to track where those negotiations were going. As of this morning, it seems like they're close to an agreement. I spoke to Chairman Smithy, who's sort of the lead Republican. He chairs the Criminal Jurisprudence Committee. Talked to Jean Wu, who's House Democratic Caucus chair, and they both said we are expecting agreement in the next couple of days, and both seemed okay with where they're trying to land, and seemed to think that enough people in both parties would vote for it on the House side, and they've been discussing with the Senate all this time. So what seemed like a pretty thorny issue, it seems like people are pointing towards the direction that it may get resolved. And so we may have our summers after all.
Great.
So was that the members on the House side saying that they have a deal? Was that their understanding?
Smithy was saying probably sometime today they would know if they would have a deal. Jean Wu, sort of in broad strokes, said he was aware of an agreement coming together and to expect some movement out of committee in the House this week, which they have to if they want to make it happen.
What are sort of the two sides of it? Not like politically or not like votes wise or proposals wise, but like why does Greg Abbott feel like this is important and what are the Democrats fighting for?
So for Greg Abbott and other Republican leaders, and Democrats don't necessarily disagree on this point, but the point is we want to keep dangerous people who have been accused of violent crimes or who have a record that shows they might be a threat to public safety and or might not show up to their court hearing. We want to keep those people behind bars so that they don't go out and commit more crimes before their case is resolved. And Greg Abbott specifically and other Republican leaders like Joan Huffman, who's leading the bills in the Senate, they've pointed to pretty graphic and horrific cases of people who have seemingly been let out on bond, who go ahead and then commit some other violent crime. These lawmakers are often surrounded by family members of crime victims. And they say this is because judges, particularly in places like Harris County, are not being thoughtful about the decisions. They're letting these people out onto the streets, and that's a threat to public safety. On the flip side of it, there's the concern that liberty should be the norm. These are people who are legally presumed innocent. That's a constitutional guarantee. And if we make detention the norm, that is an infringement of civil rights. It's going to swell our jail populations. It's an unfunded mandate to counties who have to hold all these people in these jails now. And again, just threatens to pull back on constitutional protections because anyone can be accused of a crime. Not everyone's going to be an actual threat to public safety. And it also, people on the flip side of it argue that detaining people pre-trial actually hurts public safety because it separates people from their families, makes people lose their jobs. Jails are not a pleasant place to spend your time, obviously, and can have lasting effects on that side.
We've sort of talked about this on the podcast before, Matthew, you and I, about like the pendulum swing and on this and the next issue we're going to talk about, right? Of like, there definitely was a moment where it was like, everyone is rah, criminal justice reform, jails are overcrowded, this is unjust. And now we're sort of going back in the other direction of like, certainly from Republicans, of like, we need more like harsher penalties, more of this like war on crime mentality.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that I have found confusing about this debate as it has gone on session after session is the sort of changing definition of bail reform, right? Like a lot of what bail reform was originally talked about, particularly in places like Harris County, was addressing some of the things that you were saying, Kayla, about like growing jail populations, this idea that you're, innocent until proven guilty. Bail is not supposed to be, holding someone pre-trial is not supposed to be a punishment. It's supposed to, be a public safety measure and things like that. And Abbott really kind of turned that on its head, right? And made bail reform instead, like, let's stop this practice of allowing dangerous criminals to go back onto the streets while they're awaiting trial, pointing to a lot of these cases that have happened. And, it's been a very sort of topsy-turvy, up and down process for criminal justice in this state in the last decade or so, for sure.
Yeah, it definitely is an example of like the limitations of language and the like shorthands we use. Like, because I think you say bail reform to anyone in the Capitol, you're gonna like reform means very different things depending on who you ask. So at least for us, like I think we've sort of stopped using that as a term in like headlines or stories because um, reform doesn't mean anything if we don't agree on what the problem is.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Totally.
The other issue that we've seen a real pendulum swing on in the last couple of years, and is the other thing potentially threatening our summer vacations, by which we mean like potential for special session, is THC. We did a whole episode on this, so if you want like all the in the weeds stuff, I didn't even write that pun. That was just right off the top. Go back and listen to that. But the gist, as I understand it, Kayla, and correct me if I'm wrong, because you've been covering this, is like, we passed this bill and that sort of led to many sessions ago, 2019, that led to like a deluge of consumable hemp products, THC products on the market that now are like, there is some regulation written into the law. The effect on the street is that this is basically unregulated. The legislature would like to put this genie back in the bottle to some extent. The Senate, broadly speaking, would like to see it banned entirely. The House, broadly speaking, would like to see it regulated. Where do we stand on this now?
Yeah, I mean, you summed up the differing approaches pretty well. I think Lieutenant Governor Dan Patrick says you can't regulate this stuff. You got to ban it. It's too hard for law enforcement to try to test different products to see how much THC is in there. We just got to ban it altogether. That's the only way to protect young people and protect people from using products that have way more THC than the law technically allows as it stands. The House has a very different approach. We saw State Affairs Chairman Ken King advance his own bill out of his committee. I believe it was last week. It is a much more regulatory bill rather than a straight up ban. He does address certain things that Dan Patrick thought was important, which was banning synthetics, banning vapes, but his bill would still allow for edibles, for beverages, I believe. It funnels money from the sale of these things, the tax of manufacturing and selling and producing these products in Texas, funnels some of that money to crime labs, to law enforcement, to help them, keep the guardrails on this. And it also makes sure that the packaging of these products aren't marketed toward children and are not, accessible to children. So it's a much more complicated bill, I guess, and in that it's not just a straight up black and white ban. But it is a very different thing than what Dan Patrick has called for, and Patrick has said that he would force a special session if he doesn't get this ban. So we'll have to see how they reconcile those.
Renzo, what are you
Has
hearing on
Dan
that?
Patrick weighed in on the House bill? Like, do we have any sense of how he feels about this attempt at a compromise?
I haven't heard Dan Patrick say anything about the House bill, but I have heard that Dan Patrick is serious about the special session threat when it comes to THC, specifically THC. So
With the ban, like TBD
Yeah.
on whether enough regulation would get there, but he is saying the ban is the move.
Correct.
All right, well, that's fine. We like no opinion on the legislation, but opinion on the concept of a special session.
Vacation.
Yeah. We're going to talk a little bit later about like some of the politics and the infighting we've been seeing in the chambers. But Renzo, sort of off the top of your head, what are some of the other major piece of legislation we have to see get over the finish line this session that's still sort of yet to be done?
Well, if we look at some of the governor's other emergency items, he did 7 this year. That's he did 7 last session as well. That's kind of a lot of emergency items to
Yes,
do.
lots of emergencies.
A lot of emergencies in the great big state of Texas.
Texas is on fire. I mean, well, actually, speaking of.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, one of the major priorities that have been talked about is the water bill. I believe that's still moving through. Don't think there's any set agreement on that yet. And the grid bill as well is moving through. I haven't been following those as closely, probably should be at this point, right? But
We got other reporters doing that, but yeah, it's moving. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So water, grid, I think there's still property tax
yeah,
that's getting resolved.
yeah, sounds like we have a deal on property taxes. We had both relevant committee chairs in the House and Senate announce yesterday. It's mostly the Senate plan, so it's raising the homestead exemption from 100,000 to 140,000 for everybody, and then the additional senior and people with disabilities. That additional homestead is going from 10 to 60,000. So for those seniors, that's going to be a $200,000 homestead exemption. And Dan Patrick hopes that that's going to basically wipe out property taxes for every senior. I think he was saying forever. We'll see how long,
Yeah, right. There's a lot of that.
$200,000 lasts.
Right. Yeah.
So that's the main component. Well, no, I shouldn't say that, but that's
A
the
main.
Senate
Yeah.
portion that was kind of approved as is. And then there's also the business, see if I can get this right, business personal property tax exemption. So that's like the intangible things that business would have. And that they kind of met in the middle on that. The Senate wanted to raise it from 2,500 to 25,000.
Okay.
So 10 times
Yes.
increase. And the House wanted to go to 250,000. And so they met in the middle, 125,000.
Great.
And so that's still a pretty good chunk, and businesses are pretty happy about that.
Fantastic. And we're actually going to next week have a whole episode getting into housing and property tax. We're going to take a quick break and thank our sponsors. Today's episode is supported by Protecting American Consumers Together. Learn about PAC's mission to protect families and consumers from rising costs driven by excessive litigation and lawsuit abuse at protectingamericanconsumers.org. The Safer Texas Alliance supports SB 3, advocating for responsible THC policies that protect public health and safety. Learn more at safertexasalliance.com. The Texas Managed Care Alliance is working to protect high-quality health care for Medicaid patients, ensure accountability for taxpayer dollars, and advocate for fair and competitive contracting policies. Find information at texasmanagedcarealliance.org/procurements. And the Lone Star Economic Alliance, a coalition of nearly 1,150 Texas job creators, citizens, and business associations working to restore transparency and fairness to the state's court system. Learn more at lseatx.com/the-issue. So I want to now turn to sort of the vibes of the session. As we've talked about a lot on this podcast, we've seen a remarkable amount of cohesion between the chambers, between the big three, between the leadership of the House, the Senate, the governor. As Renzo, you mentioned, they're having dinners, they're having lunches, they're having breakfast, they're showing up at press conferences together. Whole different vibe than last session where things were icy. But within specifically the House chamber itself, there's been a lot of infighting. There's been a lot of sort of messiness, if we will. Maybe you can sort of start us off and explain a little bit about, there's been several battles. Start us with what we've been calling sort of the constitutional amendment blockade, which the blockade has been lifted. But what sort of brought us to this moment of pretty significant conflict on the House floor?
Yeah, well, you were talking about the vibes. The vibes are certainly weird in the House this
Vibes are
session.
weird,
Everybody's
right?
talking about it. They're like,
Yeah.
this
Okay,
is a
great.
weird, we
All
can't
right.
get our finger on it.
Yeah.
So the constitutional amendment blockade that began pretty early on, basically when they set the first House calendar. The first couple of constitutional amendments got through, and basically what the blockade is that it takes 100 votes in the House to pass a constitutional amendment, to adopt a constitutional amendment, and with 88 Republicans, you need 12 Democrats at least on board. And so what the Democrats are doing was they all got together and I think 50, high 50s of the 62 Democrats said, we're not going to vote for constitutional amendments until we get, and they had, kind of a secret list of things that they were pushing for. One of them was to put the voucher question on the ballot in November. And that got scuttled, partially by the governor. And Republicans, left Democrats out to dry on that vote. And that was just one component, though. And after that, they kept the blockade going. They're trying to basically, the idea was to tell House leadership that the House is an independent part of the Texas government. They're independent of the Senate, they're independent of the governor, and the House needs to assert itself as such. And as you may remember, the Democrats basically got Burrows elected at the start of the session, and so they're major part of his governing coalition.
Yeah, and they've kind of come to collect, and
basically, yeah.
It's an interesting strategy. I mean, they're not saying we want everything, right? They're saying there's a couple things that we refuse to kind of compromise on. Now, on at least one you mentioned was the vouchers thing. They kind of got steamrolled anyway. So there's they're showing some power, but there's also limitations to their power.
Right.
They also have to have something to show for electing Burrows and, paving that way for him to get elected. And if they don't, then it's why did you vote for this?
Right. They have to answer to their constituents
Right,
too.
yeah.
Right? Yeah.
In recent days, you've been seeing the House Democratic leader, Gene Wu, really go into the back mic and driving the point home when it comes to the public education funding. I think at this point, that's kind of what the Democrats see as their biggest win that they can get right now. So anyway, that was going on the whole blockade, and that got some of the more conservative members in the House. There's between a dozen to 24 Republicans that have kind of been anti-Burrows or anti-leadership to varying degrees. And so a group of them, kind of because of all the constitutional amendment stuff on a specific bill, and they, broader things as well, but they went and tore down the local and consent calendar, which is this important vehicle for passing bills that everybody agrees on. They're local bills, the hospital, the fire department.
Right. Rename this bridge. We need funding for the hospital district. We need all sorts boring stuff that you don't need everyone else to agree on. You're just my district needs this.
Yeah.
Please say yes.
Yeah. So the conservatives went and they took down a couple of bills from Democrats who were had pulled a move during budget night. This is such a huge web of everything going on.
It's
tit for tat.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's a sort of little slap fight, basically.
Yeah. So kind of in response to the constitutional amendments and budget night, they took down a couple of the Democrats' bills, and then the Democrats went down and took down all the Republican bills, and just the entire local and consent calendar fell apart. And today's Tuesday. On Wednesday, sounds like they're going to try again with a new local and consent calendar. And the conservatives are kind of seeing this as a little test of, are they still serious about using the local and consent calendar as their leverage? Because we talk about the constitutional amendments being the Democrats' leverage.
The local and consent is the conservatives.
Yeah, because that threshold to take down a bill is 5 members. And so now that you've got a dozen who are consistently anti-leadership, they're able to pull that whenever they want.
And the tangible effect of that is it just slows everything to a halt, because every single bill has to then get called up, heard, voted on. I mean, we'd be every single day, we'd be here all night, and a lot of stuff would probably sort of just end up missing deadlines because
100%.
Yeah. Matthew, you've seen a wide range of strategies from these different parties over the years. I mean, what's your sense of this pulling the local and consent calendar as a strategy to get what you want?
I mean, it's a really good way to piss off a lot of people in the House, right? Because these are the bills that just it's constituent relationships, right? It's again renaming the bridge. People in Abilene don't care about the name of the bridge in Corpus Christi or that type of stuff, but it matters to a select group of people that lawmakers want to make happy. As I sort of watch this from afar, it sort of feels to me like 2 increasingly irrelevant groups in the House trying to find a way to make themselves relevant, or at least show to the people who support them that they can be relevant. I remember in the I think it was the 2023 TribFest. I moderated a panel of House Democrats, and it sort of devolved into this very angry confrontation between John Bryant and Trey Martinez Fisher about like whether Democrats are doing enough to exert their will in the House. And there is definitely a segment of the Democrats who feel like they should be acting stronger and fighting back. And I think some people look at that and be like, okay, but you don't actually have that much power, right? And that's where they come up with this constitutional blockade. And the Republicans essentially just call their bluff. They're like, we're going to pass this voucher bill, and then you're really just going to be responsible for killing a hugely necessary needed water infrastructure bill. Like, go ahead, do it and see if it works. And then on the other side, you have a House Speaker who has, this is a position that in recent years has traditionally fought with the sort of what may or may not be accurately called the grassroots wing of the party, right? And they've always been a thorn in the side. There's at times been, Dan Patrick jumping in and backing that wing. This year, Patrick taking a different approach, not really taking that side. But there's a segment of that population that really wants to step in and still sort of assert their will, or at the very least, show a certain constituency of voters that they are not just like, laying down and accepting what's going on there. But it feels to me like a session in which, the most important players in the legislature on the Republican side are rowing in the same direction, and in which Democrats are sort of in the weakest position they've been in this state for a considerable amount of time. I mean, I'll just go back and talk about how, in the 2019 session, we were coming off the Beto O'Rourke race. We were coming off this situation where we thought maybe in 2020 that Democrats might be able to flip the House. We are in a just completely different world right now. Democrats got trounced in the 2024 election. There was a poll that came out recently that showed Donald Trump +8 approval rating in the early part of April, compared to being -11 in 2017, the first year of his first term. I mean, Democrats are it's really bleak right now. And I think they're just looking for anything to point to a win. Whether they can find anything, I guess I have my doubts.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of like for Democrats and these like further right Republicans, like their worst nightmare politically is the big three rowing in the same direction. Because then it's
Exactly.
like, what do we need you guys? And I think I mean, we've talked about this a lot, but the interesting thing is like Democrats have a significant ideological difference from leadership on how the state should be run, on what we should be using our money for, on what we should be legislating, period. The gap between what these grassroots conservatives want and what Burrows, Patrick, and Abbott, three very conservative elected officials, are doing is not that vast. But we're seeing sort of equal degrees of attempted flame throwing from each, which is interesting.
Yeah, being a thorn in the side of House leadership has been a successful strategy for a certain wing of Republican, if not for like gaining power in the House, at least for, getting financial support and making, people happy in the like most activist wing in the party. And there are some people who seem to want to be kind of holding on to that playbook, even if Dan Patrick, who might be the biggest representative of that wing, seems to be thinking like, I can work with this guy.
Right. I want to briefly talk about even a schism within those more conservative, in sometimes like their main tool is like the performance art of being a thorn in the side. But even within that little cadre of people, there's been a schism, which is between our conservative lawmakers, the sort of House leadership, and the poor, bullied, beleaguered Brian Harrison, who has really become sort of like a sideshow of this whole session. Kayla, there was like a pretty explosive hearing where conservative Republican Jeff Leach, as well as many other members of the committee, really sort of took Harrison to task. What's the backstory here on what's going on?
So Brian Harrison had his first bill ever this session scheduled to be heard in committee and in Jeff Leach's committee. I think it was the week before this encounter happened. Harrison was not there when Leach called him up to lay out his bill. Um, Harrison said he was obviously voting in a different committee, and he accuses Jeff Leach of intentionally bringing up his bill while he wasn't there so he could put it aside and it wouldn't get to be heard that day. Leach said he texted him and didn't know, hadn't been told that he was voting in another committee. By the next week, it's on the agenda again. Harrison is facing this panel of lawmakers who, again, take him to town on what is in his bill and what it would do. It's a really testy back and forth. Leach steps in a couple times, one to reprimand Rep. Harrison for being on his phone while members were questioning him. It's a really tense, and it seemed to be a somewhat cathartic interaction for the
It's a good
people
word for
on
what
the
it was.
panel.
Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah, that's a good description.
I mean, it was Democrats and Republicans were getting into Harrison because, I mean, as you said, he's been kind of a sideshow all this session. He's been complaining from day one that the House is not moving fast enough, that conservative priorities are not getting heard, that actually the budget is a liberal, bloated budget, and everything that really conservative members are putting forward are actually liberal priorities, and Democrats are actually wielding power and running the show here. And he's been making all these complaints for a long time, and I think a lot of lawmakers were looking around saying, I've been working for 12 hours today, I've been hearing my constituents, I've been in so many committee hearings, I've been trying to work on my bills that I think are really conservative and really important. I don't know what you're talking about, but that is not helpful to me. And you're putting all of us on blast on X as if we were all the same, as if we were all Democrats, and that's just not true.
Right. Renzo, what are you hearing from lawmakers about how sick they are of Representative Brian Harrison?
Yeah, well, it's not just House leadership. I mean, when Brian Harrison was saying that, this is the most liberal budget, then, Dan Patrick weighed in. He was saying that, some people just want to make news. And a few weeks ago, I've lost track of time at this point, but when Brian Harrison tried to remove Burrows from the speakership
Right.
and only got...
Yeah, I totally forgot about it. My God, so much has happened.
Yeah, it was only him and one other rep who, David Lowe, was kind of, he'd been like Brian Harrison's wingman, always
The
by
heir
him
apparent, yeah.
on the mic,
Yeah.
just not even necessarily speaking on the mic, but just being there, showing support, showing face. And, he sided with him on this one. He was the only one. And since then, he's kind of stopped being at his side. And, the word you hear from some of those conservative members is, Brian Harrison has just been doing his own thing. They could have had a game plan when it came to removing Burrows, and Brian Harrison just kind of busted through and pulled that on his own when they didn't have support. They didn't have a backup plan, and so I think that was kind of the straw that broke the camel's back. But it's kind of been festering longer than that.
Yeah, and they're very, very conservative members of the House who have sort of gotten together around these issues of our bills aren't getting passed. We're not, they're doing these strategic things. And then
Very strategic.
Brian Harrison
Yeah.
out on his own. I think to some extent he wants to be I was the only member to vote to take down, he is not trying to, in reality show parlance, he's not here to make friends.
Brian Harrison against the world.
Brian Harrison against the world.
Which makes it very easy to coalesce against him.
Yeah. Yeah. It was he's unlikely to, based on the vibes of that committee, ever get a bill passed. But he'll probably get reelected. I think his constituents and his fan base on X loves him.
Yeah.
Well, and a lot of his critics are suggesting that maybe getting reelected isn't the goal, but getting elected to Congress or another seat might be the goal as well. And, he has definitely been effective in a lot of different ways at getting public attention. You left out one other place where he got kind of wrapped on the knuckles, which was when he was questioning the head of the Texas Water Development Board over DEI policies too, which brought a rebuke from, if I'm not mistaken, all three of the big three,
Yeah.
right? that. It's been an interesting session because I think there have been these moments of sort of like public humiliation that feel like they've gone a little bit farther than they have in the past. I mean, the other example of this is the Briscoe-Cain bill that went up, creating the
City of Austin.
state district of Austin or whatever, taking away local control from the city of Austin. They brought up that bill in a committee. It was voted down unanimously, and the lawmakers were just like cackling, laughing among themselves as they voted it down. And something that I had just really never seen before in terms of just kind of, I don't think Kane was in the room when that happened, but it was, it definitely felt like a, kind of a brushback pitch from the legislature. So just a little bit spicier this time around in the House committees.
Yeah, it definitely feels like, some sessions like the parents are fighting and the kids are just like along for the ride. And this session, the parents are all in agreement and the kids are tearing each other apart. And it's like, it makes for arguably like a more productive session when, the parents are all in agreement, and a slightly messier session when the kids are left to their own devices to really go at each other's throats.
Yeah.
Yeah. Great. Let's do this right now. Everyone make a prediction and we'll come back at the end of the summer. Are we going to have a special session? And if so, how many? Kayla, you
I'm
can
saying
start.
no.
Kayla's going to say no. Kayla is saying no special session.
I think bail is there's a path forward on it. THC is really the only thing I can think of that there is such a far clash, but a special over THC?
Apparently Dan Patrick is serious.
Come on.
Don't poke the bear. Renzo?
No, I'm putting no out there.
Well, with Dan Patrick being serious, I'm going to put it at one special session. Maybe not the most urgent special session, but a special session nonetheless.
A special session nonetheless.
Mhm.
Matthew?
I'm going no. I think they'll get somewhere on THC. There's time to figure it out. I know they're pretty far apart, but there might be some middle ground there. And yeah, it just seems like feels to me like a low drama session. These things I feel like they alternate a lot, so.
All right, well then I will say yes as well. So we are 2v2 and we will come back at the end of the summer and
Well,
see.
how many?
Oh, I'm
Yeah.
going to say one special
One,
session.
okay.
Oh my God. One special session.
Whoever wins gets a $100 gift card to Big Dan's weed van on Congress Avenue.
That feels like a false promise for those of us who bet on a special session that will ban THC. But yeah, we will leave it there for today. Thank you so much to our guests for joining us and Matthew for joining us from New Orleans. You can find all episodes of the TribCast on YouTube or wherever you find your podcasts. Be sure to like, subscribe, and share the podcast on all of your platforms. If you'd like to get in touch with the team, you can reach us at tribcast@texastribune.org. Thank you to our sponsors, the Safer Texas Alliance, Protecting American Consumers Together, the Texas Managed Care Alliance, and the Lone Star Economic Alliance. Our producers are Rob Avila and Chris Svoboda. Our theme music is composed by Rob, and we will see you next week.